Hey everyone, welcome back to your daily Hacker News Roundup. Yesterday was quite the day on HN. We reviewed 23 stories that hit the front page, and I've pulled the top 5 that really got the community fired up. And let me tell you, there's a theme running through today's episode that I didn't expect when I started pulling these stories together. We're talking about power, control, and who gets to decide how technology shapes our lives. From AI surveillance that knows us better than we know ourselves, to open source projects getting yanked away from their communities, to hackers trying to do the right thing and getting shut down for it. Plus, we've got some fascinating technical deep dives, including someone running a 30 billion parameter AI model on Raspberry Pis, because why not? And a heated debate about whether you really need to understand the math behind large language models or if we're all just overthinking it. So, buckle up, we're diving into yesterday's top stories from Hacker News, and trust me, some of these are going to make you rethink everything about where tech is headed. Let's start with the story that had everyone talking, and honestly, it's the one that kept me up last night thinking about the implications. All right, so our first story really caught my eye. It's titled, AI Surveillance Should Be Banned While There Is Still Time. And wow, did this strike a nerve on Hacker News with over 500 points and nearly 200 comments. And I've got to say, after reading both the article and the discussion, this one's pretty heavy. So here's the thing. We all know about online tracking, right? Cookies, browser fingerprinting, all that jazz. But this article makes a really compelling case that AI surveillance is something fundamentally different and exponentially worse. The author's main point is that when you're chatting with an AI, whether it's ChatGPT, Claude, or whatever, you're not just revealing what products you're interested in or what websites you visit. You're literally opening up your thought process, your communication style, your deepest anxieties. Think about it for a second. When you use a chatbot, especially for complex tasks or personal questions, you're essentially having what feels like a conversation with a trusted advisor. The article points out that people bare their souls to these AIs, treating them almost like therapists or close friends. And here's where it gets scary. Every single word of that conversation is being recorded, analyzed, and potentially weaponized.
The author makes this comparison that really stuck with me. Traditional online tracking is like someone watching what stores you walk into at the mall. AI surveillance is like having someone read your diary, listen to your therapy sessions, and watch you think out loud, all at once. And the kicker? Research has shown that AI chatbots can actually be more persuasive than humans. They can nudge you toward political positions, products, ideologies, and they can do it so subtly you won't even realize it's happening. Now, the Hacker News discussion on this, man, it's bleak. The overwhelming sentiment seems to be that we're already past the point of no return. One commenter basically said the ship has sailed on privacy. And honestly, reading through the thread, it's hard to disagree. People are pointing out that we already have face recognition deployed everywhere, our phones track our every move, and the economic and political incentives for AI surveillance are just too powerful to resist. But here's what really got me. Several commenters brought up this idea of retroactive punishment. Imagine this scenario. You have a conversation with an AI chatbot today about, your struggles with depression or your political views or whatever. 5 years from now, those logs get analyzed by a more advanced AI system that flags you as a potential risk or dissenter or just someone who doesn't fit the current social norms. Suddenly, you're getting mysteriously rejected from jobs, loans, even social platforms, all based on a conversation you thought was private. One user brought up this chilling example about Facebook's moderation systems. Apparently, there was this case where someone posted about a spider in their house, saying something like, "Bitch is dead," after killing it. The AI flagged it as celebrating death, and boom, account suspended. No human review, no understanding of context, just an algorithm making a punitive decision. Now imagine that kind of system with access to your most intimate conversations. What's interesting is that not everyone in the discussion was completely defeatist. There was this one commenter, Lurk, who proposed something I thought was pretty clever. They suggested treating AI assistants like lawyers or doctors, professionals who have a legal obligation to act in your best interest and maintain confidentiality, It's not perfect, but at least it's a framework for thinking about regulation that isn't just ban everything or give up entirely.
Another fascinating take was from someone who argued that if we're heading toward a zero privacy future anyway, maybe it's better if everyone has access to the surveillance data, rather than just governments and big corporations. Kind of a radical transparency approach. Though I'm not sure I want my neighbors reading my ChatGPT conversations, you know? The really troubling part is that this isn't some far-off dystopian future we're talking about. The article suggests that AI manipulation is already happening through things like SEO optimization and hidden system prompts that guide conversations in certain directions. We just don't know the full extent of it yet because, well, it's designed to be invisible. And you know what really gets me? The article's title says we should ban AI surveillance while there is still time. But reading through that discussion thread, I'm not sure there is still time. The infrastructure is being built as we speak. Every chatbot conversation, every AI interaction, it's all potential surveillance data. The question isn't whether it will be used for manipulation and control, it's how, when, and by whom. The consensus seems to be that we're heading toward a world where AI doesn't just watch what we do, it understands who we are at a fundamental level and can use that understanding to shape our thoughts and behaviors in ways we can't even detect. That's a lot to sit with, honestly. Speaking of understanding AI at a fundamental level, that actually brings us to our next story, which takes a completely different angle on the AI conversation. Instead of worrying about AI understanding us too well, this one's about whether we understand AI well enough. Now, turning to our next story, which really struck a chord with the Hacker News community, the maths you need to start understanding LLMs pulled in over 500 points and sparked quite the heated debate about what you actually need to know to understand these AI systems. So here's what's fascinating about this. The article itself promises to break down the mathematical foundations of large language models, but the discussion that erupted around it reveals something deeper. We're still collectively confused about what understanding even means when it comes to LLMs. Are we talking about understanding how to implement them, understanding why they work, or just understanding enough to use them effectively? The author, Giles Thomas, apparently has this whole series called LLM from Scratch, with 22 posts where he's building these things from the ground up. And you'd think that would be exactly what people want, right? Well, not so fast. The comment section turned into this really interesting battleground between different camps. One commenter, Income Zero, came out swinging, basically saying the whole approach is completely pointless for most people. They made this analogy that really stuck with me. They said it's like trying to explain how cars work by starting with the chemical properties of petrol. And honestly, they might have a point. If you're trying to use LLMs in your startup or integrate them into your product, do you really need to understand matrix multiplication at the lowest level? But then you've got the other side arguing that no, actually, this foundational knowledge matters. Several people pointed out that if you really want to understand attention mechanisms and transformer architectures, you need that linear algebra, you need calculus, you need probability theory. It's not just academic exercise. It's about building intuition for why these things behave the way they do. What really caught my attention, though, was this comment from Erde Haas, who pointed out something crucial. The article title might be misleading. They argued it shows you the math used to build LLMs, not the math needed to understand why they actually work. And that's a massive distinction because, and this is the kicker, we still don't fully understand why they work as well as they do. It's still an open research question. Throughout the discussion, Andrei Karpathy's name kept coming up like he's some sort of patron saint of LLM education. Multiple commenters were like, forget this article, just go watch Karpathy's videos. His content has apparently become the gold standard for learning this stuff, which, I mean, when you've got the former Tesla AI director breaking things down, that's probably a good place to start. But here's what I think is really happening here. We're seeing this tension between different levels of abstraction. You've got practitioners who just want to ship products, researchers who want to push the boundaries, educators trying to teach the fundamentals, and enthusiasts who want to understand everything. And they're all talking past each other about what understanding means. The debate also touched on something I find really interesting, this idea that maybe we're overthinking it. One perspective that came up is that for 99% of people working with LLMs, understanding the high-level concepts is enough. You don't need to know how to implement attention from scratch any more than a web developer needs to understand TCP/IP packet structure. But then, again, those 1% who do dig deep, they're the ones who might make the next breakthrough. What's clear from this whole discussion is that we're still figuring out how to teach this stuff effectively. The field is moving so fast that educational resources are struggling to keep up, and there's no consensus on what the right level of mathematical detail is. Some people are crying out for more rigor. Others are drowning in matrices and just want intuitive explanations. And you know what? Both groups are probably right. We need the deep mathematical foundations for the researchers and the serious practitioners. But we also need accessible on-ramps for everyone else. The fact that this article generated such passionate debate shows we're still working out that balance. It's actually kind of exciting. We're watching in real time as a field figures out how to explain itself to the world. But, while some folks are debating the theory of how AI works, others are just making it work in the most unexpected ways. And that brings us to a story that completely challenges our assumptions about what hardware you need to run these massive AI models. Now, this next story really caught my eye because it challenges everything we typically assume about running AI models. QWin3 30B A3B hits 13 tokens per second on 4 Raspberry Pi 5. And yes, you heard that right. Someone's running a 30 billion parameter language model on Raspberry Pis. So here's what happened. A developer managed to get this massive QWin3 30B model running across 4 Raspberry Pi 5s, and they're getting 13 to 14 tokens per second. Now, if you're not familiar with token speeds, it's not blazing fast by any means. But the fact that it's happening at all on hardware that costs less than a decent graphics card is kind of mind-blowing. The setup is beautifully simple, too. They took 4 Pi 5s with 8 gigs of RAM each, connected them with a basic TP-Link network switch, like the kind you'd buy at Best Buy for your home network, and used this software called Distributed Llama to split the model across all 4 devices. The whole thing uses about 5.5 gigabytes of memory total, which is remarkably efficient for a model this size. What I love about this is the sheer audacity of it. We're talking about hardware that costs maybe $320 total, running a model that would typically require thousands of dollars worth of GPU. Sure, they're using heavy quantization. That's basically compressing the model to make it smaller. But still, it works.
Now, the Hacker News crowd had some, let's say, mixed feelings about this. The story got over 300 points and sparked quite the debate. Some folks are calling this a democratization moment for AI. Finally, you don't need a trust fund to experiment with large language models. But others are being more pragmatic about it. One commenter, R.C. Clegg, made a pretty solid point. They called the whole thing, quote, very underwhelming, because for that same $320, you could grab a used mini PC with 32 gigs of RAM and probably get better performance. And honestly, they're not wrong. Several people chimed in with alternatives like Orange Pi boards that supposedly hit 8.2 tokens per second on a single board, or various x86 mini PCs that would blow this setup out of the water. But I think focusing purely on the performance per dollar misses something important here. This is about proving what's possible. It's about showing that distributed computing for AI doesn't require exotic hardware or specialized interconnects. You can literally do this with stuff from the electronics store down the street. The developer used A3B quantization at Q40 precision, which is pretty aggressive compression, but the model still functions. And while 13 tokens per second might feel glacial if you're used to ChatGPT's instant responses, there are actual use cases where this speed is perfectly fine.
Think about batch processing or situations where you need local AI for privacy reasons, but response time isn't critical. One interesting thread in the discussion was about enterprise applications. Someone pointed out that in certain business contexts, having a completely air-gapped AI system running on commodity hardware could be valuable, even if it's slow. Security, compliance, data sovereignty, these things matter more than speed in some scenarios. Though I've got to admit, the comment from Mr. Nintendo made me chuckle. They basically said this is only good for, quote, time-insensitive applications, which is a very polite way of saying it's too slow for most real-world use. And yeah, if you're trying to have a conversation with this thing, you're going to be waiting a while between responses. What strikes me most is how this represents a shift in thinking about AI infrastructure. We've been so focused on bigger, faster, more expensive hardware that we sometimes forget there's value in going the other direction. This project shows that with clever software and some patience, you can run genuinely sophisticated AI models on hardware that costs less than a smartphone. Is it practical? Debatable. Is it impressive? Absolutely. And more importantly, it opens doors for hobbyists, students, and researchers who want to experiment with large language models without breaking the bank. Sometimes the most interesting innovations come from people working with constraints, not in spite of them, but because of them. Now, speaking of people trying to innovate and experiment with technology, our next story shows what happens when security researchers try to help companies fix their problems. Spoiler alert, it doesn't always go well. All right, so this next one is absolutely wild. We hacked Burger King. How auth bypass led to drive-thru audio surveillance. Yeah, you heard that right. Someone found a way to potentially listen in on drive-thru conversations at Burger King, and the aftermath of this discovery is turning into quite the drama. So here's what went down. A security researcher, goes by Bob the Hacker online, discovered some pretty serious vulnerabilities in the systems that Burger King uses for their drive-thrus. We're talking about authentication bypasses that could theoretically let someone access audio from drive-thru systems. Now, the original blog post has been taken down, which we'll get to that in a second because that's a whole story in itself. What's fascinating here is how the community is reacting to this. With 175 comments and over 300 points of engagement, people are really fired up, but not necessarily for the reasons you'd think. Sure, there's the obvious, wow, that's a serious security issue reaction. But the conversation has really morphed into something bigger. It's become this whole debate about the state of security research in 2024. See, Bob apparently tried to do the responsible thing. He found these vulnerabilities, documented them, and attempted to disclose them properly to the company. But here's where it gets messy. Burger King doesn't have a bug bounty program. They don't have a clear channel for security researchers to report issues. So what's a white hat hacker supposed to do? The Hacker News crowd is seriously divided on this. You've got one camp saying, look, this researcher is taking massive legal risks here. And they're not wrong. Multiple commenters are pointing out that without explicit permission to test these systems, Bob could be looking at CFAA violations. That's the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And it's no joke. We're talking potential jail time for essentially trying to help a company fix their security problems. Then there's this other angle that's got people really riled up. The blog post got taken down via a DMCA claim. But here's the kicker. It wasn't even from Burger King. It was from some YC-funded company called Cybele, and people are calling this straight-up DMCA abuse. Like, how does a third-party company even have standing to issue a takedown notice for research about Burger King's systems? It's this perfect example of how DMCA gets weaponized to silence security researchers. One commenter made a really interesting point. They said this is exactly why so many security researchers are moving to the dark side or just selling vulnerabilities on the black market instead. When you try to do the right thing and you get threatened with legal action or your work gets censored, I mean, what message does that send? But there's also this contrarian view in the discussion that I think is worth considering. Some folks are arguing that maybe, just maybe, researchers shouldn't be poking at companies that haven't explicitly invited that kind of testing. One person pointed out that if a company doesn't have a bug bounty program, that's essentially them saying, "We don't want your help." And targeting them anyway is kind of like, well, it's complicated ethically, right? There's even this funny side debate about whether receiving passwords in plain text via email is actually a security issue. One commenter was like, actually, if it's a temporary password that has to be changed immediately, it's not that bad. And everyone else was basically like, are you serious right now? What really strikes me about this whole situation is how it highlights this fundamental tension in cybersecurity. We need security researchers to find these vulnerabilities before the bad guys do. But the legal framework we have makes it incredibly risky for the good guys to do their job. And when companies don't have proper disclosure channels, researchers are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Stay quiet and leave users vulnerable, or speak up and risk legal action. The fact that we're talking about drive-thru audio surveillance here makes this even more concerning. This isn't just about credit card numbers or email addresses. This is potentially about private conversations people are having in their cars. People talk about all sorts of personal stuff when they think they're just ordering a Whopper, you know? And honestly, the DMCA takedown thing, that's almost more disturbing than the original vulnerability. It shows how easy it is for companies to just make inconvenient security research disappear. No debate, no discussion, just gone. Several commenters are pointing out that this is becoming a pattern, where instead of fixing security issues, companies just try to silence the people who find them. The whole thing really makes you wonder about all the vulnerabilities out there that we never hear about because researchers are too scared to report them, or because they get silenced when they try. And this theme of companies using legal mechanisms to control technology and silence inconvenient voices, it's not just happening in security research. It's happening across the entire open source ecosystem, which brings us to our final story of the day. All right, so speaking of power dynamics in tech, our last story really digs into this with a provocative title, Rug Pulls, Forks, and Open Source Feudalism. This got 257 points and 142 comments on Hacker News, and honestly, the feudalism comparison alone makes this worth diving into. So Dawn Foster gave this presentation at Open Source Summit Europe, and she's basically calling out the entire open source ecosystem as, well, medieval. And you know what? She might have a point. The way she breaks it down, you've got these cloud providers at the top of the food chain, think AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, and they're essentially the feudal lords. They take open source projects, wrap them up as managed services, rake in billions, and often contribute very little back to the original projects. Now, here's where it gets spicy. Foster lays out this power hierarchy that's honestly kind of depressing when you think about it. Cloud providers are at the top of the food chain. Then you've got smaller companies trying to build open source businesses. Then the actual maintainers and contributors doing the work. And at the bottom, the users. It's like a tech caste system. But the real drama comes with what Foster calls rug pulls. And this is where the Hacker News discussion absolutely exploded. So imagine you're contributing to an open source project, right? You've put in hours, maybe years of work, and then suddenly the company behind it changes the license. Boom. What was open is now closed, or at least restricted. Redis did this. Elastic did this. MongoDB. Yep, them too. They switched to these source available licenses that basically say, hey, cloud providers, you can't offer this as a service anymore without paying us. And look, I get both sides here. One commenter going by API made this really interesting point. They said calling these license changes rug pulls is actually entitled behavior. Their argument? These are companies trying to survive, trying to pay their developers, and they're getting steamrolled by AWS, who takes their software, offers it as a service, and captures most of the value. From that perspective, the real feudalists aren't the companies changing licenses, it's the SaaS providers exploiting open source. But then you've got the other camp saying, wait a minute, you built this on the backs of community contributors who thought they were contributing to something open. And this is where CLAs, contributor license agreements, become the villain of the story. These agreements basically give the company the right to relicense your contributions however they want. So you contribute under GPL, thinking it'll stay open forever, but the company can later take all those contributions and make them proprietary. That's kind of messed up, right? What really caught my attention, though, was this counter-argument from user Dig1. They're saying AWS and other cloud providers aren't just parasites. They actually contribute back in less obvious ways. Free advertising, essentially. When AWS offers your database as a service, suddenly millions of developers know about it. They employ core developers. They build communities. It's not as black and white as cloud providers bad, open source good. The feudalism metaphor really works when you think about it, though. In medieval times, you had lords who owned the land, serfs who worked it, and this whole system where value flowed upward, but protection and resources supposedly flowed down. In open source, cloud providers own the infrastructure, developers do the work, and value flows up to the cloud providers while, well, what flows down is debatable. Here's what kills me about this whole situation. We're watching the commons get enclosed in real time. These projects start as community efforts, as digital public goods, and then market forces push them toward privatization. It's like watching the historical enclosure of common lands, but for code. And the fork option? That's supposedly the escape hatch, right? If you don't like what a company does, just fork it. But Foster points out that's not always realistic. Who's going to maintain the fork? Who's going to build the community? Who has the resources? Usually, it's another company, and then the cycle starts all over again. The sustainability question is the elephant in the room here. How do you fund open source development when the biggest beneficiaries, cloud providers, can use your work without contributing back? Some companies try the rug pull approach, changing licenses to force payment. Others try open core models. Some just burn out and disappear. You know what's wild? This whole discussion makes you realize that open source isn't just about code licenses. It's about power, money, and control. It's about who gets to decide the future of technologies that literally run the internet. And right now, that power is incredibly concentrated, just like in, well, feudal times. The comments section was absolutely on fire about this, with developers sharing their own experiences with rug pulls, debating whether CLAs are evil or necessary, and arguing about whether AWS is a parasite or a symbiotic partner. But what nobody seems to disagree on is that the current system is kind of broken. The question is, what do we do about it? And that's a wrap on yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. You know, looking back at these 5 stories, there's this thread running through all of them that I can't shake. It's about control. Who controls the AI that's learning everything about us? Who controls the knowledge needed to understand these systems? Who controls the hardware and infrastructure? Who gets to decide what security research is acceptable? And who ultimately controls the open source software that powers most of the internet? These aren't just technical questions anymore. They're questions about power, democracy, and the kind of future we're building. Whether it's AI systems that can manipulate us without our knowledge, security researchers getting silenced for trying to help, or open source projects getting pulled out from under their communities, we're seeing the same pattern everywhere. Power is concentrating in fewer hands, and the rest of us are left to deal with the consequences. But you know what gives me hope? The fact that people are building LLMs on Raspberry Pis. The fact that security researchers keep trying to do the right thing despite the risks. The fact that the Hacker News community is having these debates, calling out the problems, and refusing to just accept the status quo. Tomorrow, there will be another 20-something stories on Hacker News, and I'll be back to break down the top ones for you. Until then, keep questioning, keep building, and maybe, just maybe, be a little more careful about what you tell those AI chatbots. This has been your Hacker News Daily. I'll catch you tomorrow with the next batch of stories.